But of course, I intend not to die because Aphra Behn needs me to be alive and useful for a while. We read George Eliot, Bronte's, Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, and that was it. We read nothing else by women. And those of us who thought that women could be interesting were encouraged to read Hardy because his women were interesting. And for God's sake, Thomas Hardy's novel women are just awful. Through the first term, I repeatedly put my hand up because the degree was focused on the year 1642 and said, "What about women?" And they said to me, there weren't any then. That I decided that, okay, I would find out who the women writers were that I was told didn't exist. And what I discovered was that the first women writers in print, in large numbers, are the political radicals. They're the women who are petitioning on social matters, state matters. They're the women who join the radical religious organizations, the Quakers, the Baptists. And then I end up with the great woman writer of the period, who I thought was so good that she didn't need me. I would work on these marginal figures that nobody had ever heard of, only to come to feel, as the years passed, as the decades passed, that I wasn't happy with the work that was being done on Behn, and therefore I'd better do some.
Solomon and Smith.
Welcome to Solomon and Smith. I'm Milo Garner, he's Jack Truckenpedder. We are neither of us Solomon or Smith, but we are together Solomon and Smith. Today we are talking with Elaine Hobby about Restoration dramatist Aphra Behn, who is perhaps unfairly famous for being a woman. Elaine argues that she is in fact a great dramatist who we should pay a lot more attention to, not merely for the surprise of her gender, but in fact the great comedy and the great pathos in her many plays. But to get to Aphra Behn, we have to go through some tough times. We talked to Elaine about the English Civil Wars and that period of Puritan domination in which the theatre was outlawed. And then the restoration of the monarchy with Charles II, who thought should be a lot more fun. Life should be more fun for me, Charles, and a few of my friends. And as such brought back the theatre. And having spent time in France, seeing that there were women on the stage, which of course today would be unthinkable, but these were libertine times. So seeing those women on the stage, thought England should also have women on the stage, and maybe a few writing for the stage. And Aphra Behn, Elaine argues, was one of the greatest proponents of this newly revived art.
We can compare Charles II to our current King Charles, who also brought back the theatre after a long theatre ban under the reign of his dastardly mother, his Puritan mother, Elizabeth II, who famously destroyed all the English theatre houses, had playwrights burned at the stake.
It was a dark time.
It was a dark, dark time, and she was the longest reigning monarch in English history, which meant the darkness just kept going. Thankfully, her noble son, Charles III, has reinstituted the theatre as a medium. Not only has Charles III brought back the theatre to England, but he's also, for the first time in centuries, allowed men to be seen on the English stages. Previously unthinkable. All the way back to Victoria, men have not been seen on the English stage.
It would be imprudent, I thought, for a man
It was imprudent. It was
trot the boards, as it were.
To strut and fret her hour upon the stage was a naturally feminine pursuit, or has been for the last 200 years of English history. But Charles III, he's a broad-minded fellow.
We talked about espionage, spying, deceiving. Aphra Behn was a spy before she was a playwright.
Deceiver.
In the streets of Antwerp, she stalked and looked around.
Professional deceiver. I've also been to Antwerp, and I'm sure I told a lie or two.
Raconteur. And this is what we talk about a lot in the episode. Raconteurs, rakes, people who lie to sleep with women or do other such things in the night. Many of Aphra Behn's most famous characters are rakish men, sort of Earl of Rochester types.
You could go look at our interview with Jane Cooper where we talk about the Earl of Rochester.
It's all interconnected. It's a sort of multiverse situation we got going on the channel here. So we have these rakes knocking about, but we also have these rather interesting, maybe we call them the anti-rakes, the women who dress up to trick the rakes into marrying them, which frequently seems to work out. Is Aphra Behn doing something interesting here? Is Aphra Behn actually giving her female characters sort of internal world that they didn't have in the plays of her contemporary male playwrights? Another character we get in a lot of Aphra Behn plays is the ludicrous Whig Puritan.
Whig spelled W-I-G.
Thank you for that.
Likey the video. Please like this video.
Please.
Subscribe to the channel if you are not already. We know from the statistics that many of you are not. What do you have to lose, man?
We
or
get
woman?
everything.
Episode appropriate.
Everything.
Everything. If you'd like to support us with sort of gold bars and doubloons and such, there is a Patreon link that you can access down below. We're enormously grateful for all the support we get. You can leave a comment on this Aphra Behn figure. You know, who is the most underrated, universally known writer? Woman. Okay, the world's most underrated woman. All the comments just Margaret Thatcher. We're like, no, what have we done? Do you mostly read in your sort of academic domain, Elaine, or you're a pretty all over the place reader?
I think even at the age of 5, I realised that given nothing else, I would read the cereal packet. Reading is necessary. And my grandsons who are now 16, they're twins. The first time they camped overnight, so they would have been 7 or something, 6, okay. And in the back garden. And their mum sent me a photograph, and the 2 sleeping bags were there in the tent, and each of the boys had got whatever he was currently reading on his pillow. It wasn't possible to be imagining a bed without a book. So I think I read, everywhere.
Everywhere and everything, and always the case since like youngest childhood. Were both your parents fairly bookish?
My parents were very keen readers. They weren't educated people, and my dad left school at 13. He was the son of a carpenter. My mum did go on and get school certificate, but she would rather be outside and playing games or walking the dog or something. So reading was thought of as a completely acceptable activity in my childhood. But academics, there's nothing academic in my background at all.
And what did you most enjoy reading, like as a child? Was it just, like always children's books, or were you some sort of interesting, precocious things in there?
I read my way through the local library, all the children's books. By the time I was about 10 or 11, I literally read everything. So I remember, for instance, reading C.S. Lewis's, whatever it's called, that then ends with The Last Battle. And I can remember reading The Last Battle and feeling completely furious that I'd been conned, that clearly this story that I've been enjoying so much got a moral, and I didn't want a moral, thank you. And at that point, the librarian let me through into the next room, which was the adult reading. And I was allowed to choose things from the book, from shelves there. But I couldn't take anything that she didn't approve as being suitable for me. And that was from about the age of 10. So I started reading. I think my early adult reading was all detective fiction. And that's still what I read, usually for leisure. Something with a plot, something with characters, something that doesn't really connect to anything that I'm actually thinking about, because otherwise I won't go to sleep. So I did go through a period where I thought, okay, I will loop through three different things. I'll read detective fiction, and then I'll read something great that I've never yet read. A lot of that being European fiction. And then I'll read something I ought to have read, like Don Quixote
Okay,
or
yeah,
something
yeah.
like that. And that worked very well. So why I stopped, I don't know. But currently, reading is, reading at night is reading of detective fiction. So,
And who is the greatest literary detective? I'm sure you've read them all.
oh, I don't know. That's you see, I'm very disinclined to this um, ranking of quality thing.
All
Just,
equal.
no, they're not all equal. I mean, I do remember one day coming home from marking students' work, at the end of the year kind of assessment point, and finding myself reading an Agatha Christie, for God's sake, and really annoyed by its punctuation. So at that point, I realized that Agatha Christie really couldn't punctuate any more than my students could. And I stopped. I never tried reading Agatha Christie again, which I think I had been doing, but I just found it too annoying. So no, they're not all equal.
Agatha and her semicolons.
Yeah, exactly. No, no idea how to punctuate. Yeah.
Yeah, curious. Yeah, I mean, if I think on sheer volume numbers, sort of shifted, she is the most popular English writer ever.
Yeah.
I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure that's correct. I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
Shakespeare and J.R. Tolkien and everyone, the numbers,
Yeah.
if you accumulate the whole international sales.
Yeah, anybody who's ever read it. I mean, I,
Hmm.
I think, of the sort of early detective fiction writers in early 20th century, I say Dorothy Sayers is wonderful. But
Yeah,
again, you
yeah.
see, I love things with plots and characters. A very, very simple delight in plots and characters, and Dorothy Sayers could do both. So, you know, she's my girl.
Yeah. I was
Yeah.
interested in the fictional detectives themselves, less their literary
Ah.
qualities, more their kind of peculiar genius. Who would you like to solve the murder of solve your own murder? If you could bring one in, make sure justice is
Um,
done.
One of my fascinations ever since childhood and then all the way through my adult life is to do with the human body and how it works. So I'm afraid I'm one of those people who is interested in the kind of forensic science based and anatomy based and autopsy based stuff. So if I've been horribly killed, I would definitely want somebody highly skilled to do the autopsy. And once upon a time, I might have said, someone like Patricia Cornwell's um, heroines, but again, I find Cornwell quite annoying now. So I don't know.
When
I
you've written 800 books, not all of them can be.
Yeah,
There was a time when Cornwell was like churning out two a year pretty
yeah,
reliably. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, indeed. So, but of course, I intend not to die because Aphra Behn needs me to be alive and
Hmm.
useful for a while. See, you may know this sort of thing anyway, but you see, I'm 70 this month. So if
Hmm.
you're 70 this month, the fact that time will come to an end for you is very clear. And all my life I've known that I would die, but actually you get clearer as you get older, as I suppose in part it is because your peers start dying around you in large numbers. Um, but that sense of, well, what do I need to achieve before I die? And certainly getting the Ben edition finished, for instance, is
Hmm. Should I read a little poetic epigraph?
do.
I didn't get much time on this. This is like the product of the last 20 minutes or so because I realized we didn't have one yet. But here's my poetic epigraph. Naples conveys her daughters through tubes of tissue into warm salt water, where they become coins. From the docks, Englishmen issue, inwardly sunburnt, like sentient pork. They kneel in the waves and stuff the money into their loins. Undertakers observe them from the boardwalk and size them up, by habit, for their graves. By the the time they return to London, their cargo has morphed into beautiful naked actresses, upon whom the king has wisely placed an embargo. All must be cocooned in white dresses and fed to gigantic slime husbands, who promise the crown to excrete them as starlight, as is the nation's custom. All this and more in Dorset Gardens tonight.
I'll be there. So we go from Naples and the Rover and perhaps the Emperor of the Moon as well back to London.
Yeah.
Terrible. Yeah.
Dreadful. How did you get into Restoration theatre, Elaine? Like, presumably everyone around you, Jacobean and Elizabethan. Like, what interested you and
my
really got you into it?
routine? My routine was through 1970s feminism. So I was an undergraduate student in the 1970s. Elaine Showalter, Ellen Mers published their first books about forgotten 19th century women writers or neglected 19th century women writers during the year that I was a finalist. And as a 1970s feminist, I quite quickly thought, okay, well, I need to work on women's writers because there weren't any taught when I was an undergraduate. You know, we read George Eliot, the Brontes, Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, and that was it. We read nothing else by women. And those of us who thought that perhaps women could be interesting were encouraged to read Hardy because his women were interesting. And you know, for God's sake, Thomas Hardy's novel women are just awful.
I can't say I remember any of them.
Well, they die and they're very sexual. Yeah. Anyway, so and of course Dickens's women as well, similarly irritating. So I thought that what I was going to do was work on women's writing in the period immediately before the Victorian.
Right. Yeah.
And instead, I did a master's degree at Essex, and I've written about this and said, and this is a cartoon; it's not literally true, but the master's degree, which was focused on what we would today call literary theory. Through the first term, I repeatedly put my hand up because the degree was focused on the year 1642 and said, "What about women?" And they said to me, there weren't any then. So, you know, I went to the library and looked for some. And so that then produced my master's thesis, which was on Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle, and then produced the PhD that I decided that, okay, I would find out who the women writers were that I was told didn't exist. And because this was then 1979, I sat down with the huge Donald Wing's short title catalogue of books published 1640 to 1700 and read it and made index cards for anything that looked as if it might be by a woman.
Okay.
And then organised those cards into chronological order and read my way through from 1649 to 1688, reading everything as I went. This is a very long answer to your question. So, what I discovered was that, if you like, the first women writers in print, in large numbers, are the political radicals. They're the women who are petitioning on social matters, state matters. They're the women who join the radical religious organizations, the Quakers, the Baptists.
And during the Civil War, presumably.
Yeah,
sort of,
that's
yeah,
right.
in
The war and afterwards. So I worked mostly on the Civil War radicals into about 1990. And I then got interested in the history of the midwifery manual. Since that was the period in the 1990s where what everybody was starting to think about was stuff to do with the body and sexuality and so on. I thought, okay, that's where I'm going then. And became especially interested in the midwifery manual published by a woman in 1671, Jane Sharp, who was a midwife. And for about 15 years, I used to say to people, I got lost in the human body. And I'd always intended to go back to the radicals, and instead went to a conference at which Aphra Behn was being talked about. And I thought, where the research is going on Ben really won't do. And decided in 2010, and then, from 2012, that what I needed to do was to get together a new edition of Behn's works that would be constructed with different assumptions from the things that people were saying about her. So my influence, my history, my journey in, if you like, comes from feminism, comes from women writers. And then I end up with the great woman writer of the period, who I thought was so good that she didn't need me. I would work on these marginal figures that nobody had ever heard of, only to come to feel, as the years passed, as the decades passed, that I wasn't happy with the work that was being done on Behn, and therefore I'd better do so.
What was insufficient about the work then being done on Behn?
I think part of it, a crucial part of it, is that people like me, so 20th century feminists, wanted to find a woman writer who, in a sense, could speak for us. She could be us. She could be concerned with the things that we were concerned about. She could see the world in a way akin to how we see the world, and so on. And so, even from feminists, what emerged was an account of Behn in which they needed her to be somebody who had particular kinds of positions, for instance, on sexuality, for instance, on sexual libertinism. So I think that was part of it. And then, of course, on the other hand, the stuff that wasn't the new feminist reading mostly just saw her as being like the men, but not as good. So I was happy neither with the traditional dismissal of Behn, if you like, nor the kinds of questions that people were taking to Behn, because they weren't doing what I knew I could and had to do, which is to go from the perspective of other women writers and other women activists in her period and think about, okay, so where is she in relation to that? Rather than thinking about, well, as you say, Shakespeare or John Dryden, of course, as the poet laureate in Behn's age.
How did Behn fit in to her time then? I suppose that's another very big question, but I suppose particularly in relation to the foregoing civil war, to all the radical religious movements, the radical political movements around her. Because my sense of her is someone more on the Tory side of things, but I wonder if you could elaborate on that. How did Behn fit into her time?
Quick sketch then. So as you say, we have the civil wars. We then in 1660 have the restoration of the monarchy in the person of Charles II. And what Charles II brings with him is the assertion that the Puritans were no fun, the Quakers were no fun, we're going to be lots of fun now. And it's a little bit like how at least some of us felt watching Boris Johnson whilst people died. It's sort of, do you really think that putting a buffoon in charge makes things all right? And one way of reading Charles II would be that exactly what he did is he himself and those around him put buffoons in charge, and they were extremely wealthy and extremely powerful, and they did what they liked. From 1660, restoration of the monarchy, one of the things, as I'm certain whereas before the Restoration period, you've only got men acting on stage. So you have young men playing female parts and older men playing male parts. Charles II, having been to the theatre in France during the Civil Wars, thinks, oh, it's much better if you've got women on
more
stage.
Fun.
Much more fun and much sexier if you're a heterosexual man. And so he passed this requirement that women on stage must be played by women, that you couldn't have any of this, as Heath said, disgraceful, immoral thing of having men playing women. Um, and then what emerges is a kind of comedy in part. One of the things that happens is that the woman protagonist cross dresses. Because, of course, if you live in a culture that says that women's legs are really sexy and you must never see her ankles, then if you make the woman dress up like a man and put her in trousers and throw bare her ankles, then Charles and all his fun-loving friends will really love it because they can see the barely dressed woman on stage. And then similarly, in tragedies, you have plots in which women get threatened with rape and get overwhelmed with emotion and so on. And you can have that on stage, and that's fun too, isn't it? So that's the world that she arrives in.
Was the English stage unique in the sort of Shakespearean era of casting boys in the women's roles? Was this something unique to the English stage? Were the rest of Europe doing that? Was this just a weird English thing that we didn't put women on stage?
It is a very weird English thing. It is. I think I'm not knowledgeable beyond these islands, really, other than things that Ben translated. I can talk about those.
Okay.
But I certainly it's the case that in most European countries, by the time you're in the 17th century, so by the time you're in Shakespeare's time, you've got women playing women's parts. And it is a weird English thing that you can't put a woman on stage, that's disgusting, immoral. Anyway, it's doing men out of jobs, and you can't do that, can you?
What was disgusting and immoral about it? What were some of the justifications at the time for the practice?
Perhaps a modern connection might be thinking about religions. The most obvious one would be Islam, where you need to cover up the female body, that the female body, indeed the human body, shouldn't be on display, should it? It should be covered. And in that period, in the period before Ben, the period of Shakespeare and afterwards, the female body is a problem and shouldn't be exposed. It should be at home. And of course, that isn't really how real women lived, if you like. But once you're in a public space, then it's not acceptable for a woman's body to be there on stage. And I'm sure there are lots of places. My mind immediately goes to Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, and Cleopatra thinking about what it would be like to be played by a boy on stage,
Yeah.
and how demeaning that would feel in a way that she can't. But of course, in the meantime, it's a young man who's playing Cleopatra.
Interesting meta.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what do we suppose with the restoration brings women on stage? And this is a response to the Puritan ban on theatre altogether during the Oliver Cromwell period. And I wonder if we can speculate a little bit. If we imagine the English stage to have continued without this interruption, without this complete battening of the theatres, where might it have gone? Can we imagine organically that women would enter the stage, or is this interruption crucial to actually the kind of radical reinterpretation of theatre? And it becomes, raunchier and more scandalous, but equally sort of prepares the way for a more equitable theatre. Indeed, not only women on the stage, but women writing for the stage. And it seems as though you needed almost this just complete clearing of the slate and then a reinvention of the form.
Yeah. I've never thought about this simply in terms of theatre. I've always thought about it in terms of, in the civil wars, what you have is that upturning of society. The majority of people who are the early Quakers, who are, the most radical groups, are women. They're not men. There are lots of women involved in radical activities. Now, those are all things that Aphra Behn, who indeed, is committed to the returned monarchy and then committed to the succession, that the Catholic James can come to the throne next. So Aphra Behn mocks and satirizes Puritan type figures, if you like. Um, but she gets the benefit from their existence in the sense that, at least this is what I believe, that the world has turned upside down. And once you've cut off a king's head, and once people have started to say that they can work out from reading their own Bibles what God wants, they don't have to do as they're told, if you like, they can work it out for themselves. That in that world of topsy-turviness, you have the possibility of women making their way in various ways in a new world. And I've never thought about it as being to do with the stage itself. And therefore, I mean, I would say to you that certainly any notion that there's a real break in the development of theatre is probably not right, insofar that Behn, like most of her playwriting contemporaries, are using as the basis for many of their plots and many of their characters plays that come from Shakespeare's period and from the 1630s and 1640s, some of which are then published in the 1650s, whilst the theatres are closed, people still want to read plays. And so they're reading these plays that haven't been in print until then. And I'm sure she read all of those things. She must have done, because she uses them all the time in her own plays. So other than the fact that, Charles and his courtiers had seen women on stage over in France in particular, and they wanted some women on stage, therefore, so they could ogle them. I've never really thought of this as something that is to do with theatre, if you like. I've thought of it as to do with wider world. I don't know. You tell me.
Wish I could. Wish I knew the answer there. I mean, it's just but complete speculation to imagine, that England without the civil wars is a completely foreign suggestion because as you say, everything turned upside down. And
Yeah.
afterwards, I mean, we have this period we're talking about now, the Restoration, which then ends with William III and Mary coming across, Glorious
Mm,
Revolution, and
mm,
thereafter maybe an England, a Britain more familiar to us, because I think with the Bill of Rights, you sort of that sets the scene for what the
mm.
monarchy will mean, the relationship, whereas the Restoration is still in the topsy-turvy period of, all right, we'll bring the monarch back, but it will be different and it will be strange. And we had this long Cavalier Parliament where everyone seemed to be a royalist, or at least
Yeah.
curious about royalty. And I think Aphra Behn's greatest characters are her Puritan or Whig stereotypes. Mr. Tickletext, not
Yeah.
only the name, but everything he says is just sort of wonderful caricature. And again, one that we have to thank the years of turmoil to even have access to. It's a
Yeah.
character type that doesn't exist in Shakespeare because the guy didn't really exist
Mm.
to mock, to
Mm,
satirize. You needed
mm,
this species of man to have been in ascendancy for a couple of decades
mm.
in order to make fun of him. And it's in the same way that Aphra Behn is sort of produced by the Civil War period in being so opposed to it. But I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about the early Aphra Behn. I know shrouded
Mm.
in mystery and obscurity, and there's a lot about her being a spy, about her
She was a
traveling to
spy.
exactly,
Yeah.
it's traveling to English colonies, being sort of all
Maybe.
about the place, potentially joining the court of Charles II. What do we know about the early Aphra Behn, and how did she end up in theatre rather than the many other places she seemed to
Yeah.
travel around
Yeah.
in?
What we know for certain is that her name, Aphra, was quite a common girl's name down in the east of England when she was born in 1640. And so when people first started trying to work out who she was, they had lots of contenders. And if you go online and look for her, you'll find all kinds of stories telling you, oh, she was this person, she was that person. She wasn't. She was the daughter of a man called Bartholomew Johnson in Harbledown on the edge of Canterbury. So she was definitely born on the edge of Canterbury. Her dad, Bartholomew, was definitely an innkeeper, having been a barber in Canterbury. And she lived there until she was probably about 16. And at that point, the family moved to London and lived very close to Tower Bridge. And there is a record of um, Aphra Johnson, being betrothed to a man called John Halse There is no record of the marriage, but whether the marriage went ahead or not, we don't know, because in 1657, well, there are so many records that don't survive, and people who don't go along with the Cromwellian, if you like, kind of Puritan government, Puritan church, very often, if they could afford it, would get married in private houses and so on. So she might have married this man, John Hall's. The marriage might not have happened. But therefore so on her father's side, what she is the daughter of a barber and an innkeeper. Her mother is kind of lesser gentry, fallen gentry. And indeed, her mother gives birth to Aphra's eldest sibling, Aphra's sister, Frances, about 5 months after the marriage. So I think we can all deduce, if you like, how the marriage came about. And we really, I mean, at the moment, at least, we know nothing beyond that. I mean, we do know that obviously she could read and write. And we know that being able to read in that period is very common. You know, that people might think that that's something that doesn't really get going until the 18th century or till the 19th century. But in fact, reading is something that's brought in effectively by the Church of England, by Protestantism, because whereas Catholicism is based on an assumption that the priest instructed by the Pope knows truth, has direct line to God. Protestantism believes that believers must read their Bible for themselves and form their own relationship with God. And of course, again, we've probably all known this since we were children. You know, it's Henry VIII because he wants to marry, he wants to divorce his wife and remarry, who takes England out of the Catholic Church in the early 16th century. It becomes required to be Protestant if you're English. That doesn't mean that everybody is, but that is the required state position. And therefore, that people should be able to read their Bibles for themselves becomes very important. So given that that's the cultural context, it's not surprising that Aphra Behn, the daughter of a barber and innkeeper, should be able to read. On her mother's side, the lower gentry side, if you like, well, whilst certainly if you were a shopkeeper or a barber, you would keep records, you would have to be able to write. So probably, you know, there would have been pressure, if you like, within the family from the father's side. Within the mother's side, women from a nice background would be expected to be able to read, and probably be expected to be able to read French, which of course Behn uses a lot in her late career. So we can make guesses that are founded on that. Growing up in Canterbury, moving to London as a teenager, and then in the mid 1660s, around the time of the Great Fire, of the Plague and then the Great Fire, Behn gets sent to Antwerp as a spy. And so I would guess that on the mother's side, she's probably networked with people who are, for instance, living at the Inns of Court, you know, people who are at that kind of social level. And perhaps it's through that. I mean, people say Charles II sent her. Well, he did in a sense, but in even, you know, in the same way that today you'd say that people do something that the king requires or the prime minister requires or whatever. The chances of it actually being to do with that individual powerful man are quite remote. So the idea that there's direct connection between Behn and the monarchy, you know, the person of Charles II is quite remote. I'm not saying nobody will solve it, you know, will find it, but I think it's unlikely. And so Behn gets sent to Antwerp as a spy. And there are letters home, constant letters home to the spy masters saying, if you don't send me some money, I'm going to starve here. And they don't send her money and they don't send her money, which is true of everybody who works for the government pretty much overseas. And eventually she borrows money. She comes back to England and she's threatened with debtor's prison. And during that period, Aphra Behn says to one of her contacts, that she will ask her mother to go and see the Queen, go and see the King and put the case to the King. And in our thinking, this is, oh, this is extraordinary. You're moving in these upper echelons. But back in the Tudor and Stuart period, you've got a personal monarchy. People would assume that individuals might try, if they could get there, to approach the monarch. So again, there's no necessity of a direct connection. There could be a connection, but we don't know it. But anyway, so she is a spy. Some people like to believe she went to Suriname. I like to not believe it. Suriname, of course, is where much of the action, or half of the action, of Aphra Behn's most famous work, Arunico, takes place. So Arunico, born in Africa, tricked into slavery by white people, transported to South America, to Suriname, where he is enslaved. The narrator of that story, Arunico, is just like the kind of woman that Aphra Behn was writing the story for, which is to say she's young and white. She's also an idiot. But people read that narrator as if, oh, that is Aphra Behn. And because, of course, as we all know, women have no imagination, could not possibly invent something on the basis of a little information. People assume, well, she couldn't have written about Suriname if she hadn't been there. Well, don't see it myself. There you go. So she might or might not have been to Suriname. Certainly in 1670, her first play is staged at the Duke's Theatre, and it runs for 6 nights consecutively, which is a pretty extraordinary success in those days.
Yeah, right.
And the prologue to the play is all about spying. And it's jokes about spying and spies, and there being spies out in the audience and so on. So from which one can deduce, I think, that the kinds of people who went to the theatre were quite likely to know that Behn had gone as a spy, and having the prologue refer to the spying was a way of bringing the audience in, of engaging them, of making them feel that this is addressed to them, and so on. So we know that. And then, you see, when you said to me early Behn, and I thought, okay, Forced Marriage, Amorous Prince, those are the first 2 plays. I wasn't thinking Behn as a child, about whom we know almost nothing. I was thinking early Behn, 1670. So the first play, as I say, makes reference to her being, well, to spies and spying. With both the first 2 plays, what you have is a central royal figure who is not to be trusted and who is dangerous. So with the forced marriage, the forced marriage is forced because the king insists that a young woman must marry this man who is his favorite. And so it is literally a forced marriage. And absolutely overtly borrowing from Shakespeare's Othello, that man then kills the young woman, believing that she's been unfaithful to him, and either strangles her or suffocates her. Behn gives the actor a choice in 1671 when the play's first printed. And in the second play, The Amorous Prince, opens just getting out of bed with young Cloris, whom he has seduced and promised to marry. And he then proceeds to go and stand in the woods with his best mate who's waiting there, and brags to the best mate about how he's had this woman, but of course he won't have sex with, he won't marry her as he's promised, but he's managed to have sex with her. And what he doesn't know, what the prince doesn't know, is that the young man he's bragging to, his best friend, is actually the brother of the young woman he's just seduced. And the prince then proceeds to try to rape his best friend's beloved. So if you take what does Behn do in her first 2 plays, you've absolutely got an author who isn't simply pro-royalist, simply thinking that the fun, so-called, that Charles has brought back with him is something that people should just go along with and have fun with. And one of the things that is to me very interesting about Behn is how, having in her early plays done this quite dangerous stuff, and yet nonetheless got accepted by the Duke's company, and she writes plays for them constantly. When it comes to it, when it comes in the late 1670s to, okay, where are you going to stand? Who should be Charles II's successor on the stage? He's got no legitimate children. He's got lots of illegitimate children, which are not legally meant to come to the throne. But his brother is a Catholic. And according to to British imagination, as you know, in that period, the Catholics are dangerous. They're like Louis XIV. They're absolute monarchs. They're people that you would not wish to be on your throne. They will try and destroy the Church of England. And what Aphra Behn does, like quite a number of the playwrights of the period, is that she positions herself on the side of the monarchy and therefore on the side of succession, and writes a series of plays which, as you were talking about earlier, mock these Puritan figures that are the Restoration stage's invention. And they're explicit, they're dedicated to members of the royal family, they're explicitly on the side of the succession. And I believe that what happens is that after 1685, when James indeed comes to the throne and becomes James II, Aphra Behn, like so many Anglican Tories, is faced with the reality of what having this Catholic king would mean, which isn't what she wanted at all. It isn't what she meant at all. But of course, she dies soon thereafter. So we don't get to see how she resolves that problem.
Yeah, and I'm interested because often if you say someone is a spy and then becomes a playwright, this seems like an unlikely change in career. But I think, to engage in more
Graham Greene.
rabid speculation, espionage is a kind of sort of physical theatre. It requires acting, it requires imagination.
True,
You change your setting. I mean, if we certainly we believe the Antwerp story, so we have Aphra Behn in
That's true.
Antwerp as someone
Yeah.
other than herself or portraying herself in a different way. So I can see her sort of life as a spy then metamorphoses into the spying of the stage. Let's invent this and put it here. And of the Aphra Behn plays I've read, most of them take place in Naples, or rather away from here, and it's a sort of classic theatrical spin to find somewhere else and then have
Mm,
characters who are like the characters we know in reality, but they aren't quite as in these early plays you've mentioned, which may
mm,
refer to the monarchy, but perhaps at a step removed. And
mm.
I suppose we don't have any other information about this apparent transformation of Aphra Behn. We know she was a spy. We know she wrote plays, and we know that her first play mentions the two sort of careers simultaneously.
Mm,
But we just it's just the realm of speculation.
mm,
Mm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder, like, was Ben immediately, was there something unique about her plays, coming out of the gate? Maybe we're in an age that maybe overprizes uniqueness in writers, but
Hmm.
I'm curious whether Ben's first plays, first comedies when they were coming onto the restoration stage, whether they sort of blended in, or whether there were aspects of them that really made an audience member want to ask, who wrote that one? That was an interesting one.
If you like, the play that people who know Ben at all will know, which is The Rover, which is one
Mm.
of those indeed that are Naples set, as Milo was just referring to. Um, the Rover might be a really interesting example of that question of how does she relate to her contemporaries, because in various ways, um, today's readers, and I remember the first time I read The Rover, which is, you know, 50 years ago, probably now. Yeah. In the scene in which the rakish hero tries to rape the young woman who's out in her informally dressed, lightly dressed in her night clothes, waiting to elope with the man she loves. And there she is. And Wilmore stumbles in drunk and sets about trying to rape her and trying to tell her that she's consenting to this. And Wilmore says to her, look, if a judge saw you dressed like that and looking like that, who's he going to blame? He's going to blame you. It's your fault, isn't it? And I can remember when I first read that play, and I was at that point working for the Birmingham Rape Crisis Centre, and I was shocked, rigid, that that back in 1677, Behn would be showing a world that's set up to tell women, if you're dressing like that, you're asking for it. And then, of course, as you read on in that play, what happens in the last scene is that a man, Blunt, starts again to try to rape Florinda, or thinks that he might. And his male friends come in and they decide they'll all have a go. And the only question is who's going to go first. And again, that idea that a woman faced with a group of men is in more danger than a woman faced with a man on her own seems like a very modern way of seeing things. So I would say, to a modern reader, part of what this play is startling. What is startling about this modern play, this play, is how modern it is in what it's saying about, for instance, the threat of sexual violence. The play, first performed in 1677, was massively popular on the Restoration stage. Because there are almost no records of performances in Aphra Behn's period, we don't know how many times it was performed, but we do know that as from 1705, I think it is, when the theatres start to advertise in the newspapers as to what they're playing, we do know that the Rover was played every season in London for the next 50 years. So this is a play that was on the stage every season, probably for 60 or 65 years, because you don't suddenly start performing an old play and perform it every year if it hasn't actually been a stock play, if it hasn't been part of the repertoire. So either we completely misunderstand our forebears and they shared our sense about sexual violence and its threat, and that's why they kept going to this play, or the play has other things that appealed to the audience then, and it gets picked up as being this great popular thing for reasons that are not to do with what today we would say is its greatness, or maybe it's both. And I would say it's both. That Aphra Behn writes a play, and indeed, one of the things that is most wonderful about the Rover is that it is in some ways quite closely based on Thomas Killigrew's Tomaso. So most of the characters, many of the scenarios are taken from Killigrew's play. And what you can do is you can look at side by side what Killigrew does with a character or a scenario and what Behn does with supposedly the same character, the same scenario. And repeatedly what you see is Behn showing women looking after each other, turning to each other, getting help with each other. You see men playing games of doing each other down, of wanting to be better than one another. You see threats of male violence. So Behn, I think, is writing a different kind of play from Killigrew is writing. But the audience could read it as a different kind of play or as just the same kind of play. And indeed, this is again one of the things that's well known about Behn, is that James, the future James II, the Duke of York, loved the Rover, thought it was very complimentary, so that Behn wrote a second part of the Rover and dedicated it to James because, he loved the play so much. Now, James was an idiot, So the fact that he thought that the play was complimentary, which presumably he did, he thought that the Wilmore, the rakish figure, is some kind of compliment, I imagine. That doesn't mean that that is how Ben wrote it, but it's readable as that.
I know
Yeah.
in Queen Anne, in one of her letters, when she went to see the Rover, she described the. It was more about the actor playing Wilmore than the character Wilmore, but they conflate, I suppose. And she said it was worrying how delightful he made sin seem.
Yeah,
And maybe one of the things that strikes me most as a modern reader, again, it's more to do with one's ideas about 17th century Britain, is just how sexually libertine it is.
yeah,
There is kind of this extraordinary, frank attitude towards sex and sexual desire, men and women, that really I associate much more with sort of 1930s Hollywood than I
yeah.
do with a Britain just coming out of the Puritan era. And maybe as in the case of early Hollywood, it is sort of overcompensating for a latent Puritanism in the general population. I suppose there is this kind of using theatre, using the imaginative transaction of watching a story acted out. You're able to sort of, you know, purge the drives within yourself, and in the case of Hollywood and Restoration Theatre, specifically the sexual drives in this sort of fantasy world where there's kind of no other meaning of life in the Rover. There isn't really. I mean, maybe you disagree. There's money involved, but I mean, every single character, the primary sort of telos, the thing they're aiming for is some sort of sexual consummation of various different kinds.
Well,
Yeah.
I would have to say to you yes and no, because as you said, money is involved. And I think that what you were just saying about, if you like, what the general appeal is of restoration comedy to the male audience is quite right, that it does relate to these questions of repression and denied desires and so on. I think that if you go across to Ben's plays, what you see again, if we stay with the Rover for a moment, is the economic, the different economic position of men and women means that the sexual available choices are actually different. They might look the same, but they're not the same. So in the Rover, you've got the figure of Angelica Bianca, who is the whore, the courtesan. Angelica Bianca has, we learn, had this long-term relationship as a kept woman with a man who's died. Of course, if she had been his wife, she would be his widow and she would have
Yes.
an independent income. Since she was the kept woman, once he's dead, what she's got to do to keep an income is to find another keeper. And that's what she's doing in Naples. She's looking for another man to keep her. Helena, the kind of virgin who is looking for a husband, is who ends up with Wilmore, God help us. She is, and it's explicit in the play. It's very unusual that she has control of her own fortune. That her brother, who is her keeper in a sense, can't keep her money from her, and that it's up to her to decide who she marries. Of course, legally, once she's married, her money belongs to her husband.
Mhm.
And indeed, the moment at which the whore, Angelica Bianca, believing that the man who she has fallen for, Wilmore, believing that he is now after an heiress, Helena, says to him, I wish I could believe that you just wanted for her money.
Hmm.
He talks about this woman being worth 200,000 crowns, which is, a lot of money in anybody's, even today. And, today it's worth sort of, it's like she's a millionaire. And Wilmore, who until that moment has just been wanting to bed the virgin, which is the usual plot desire in these comedies.
Hmm.
Wilmore says, "My gypsy worth 200,000 crowns. Oh, how I long to be with her." And he shifts from wanting to bed her to wanting to marry her. Because, of course, once she's married to him, she is no longer financially independent. He's got the money. Now, one of the things I think that is exceptional and exceptionally interesting about
Hmm.
Ben is that question of that financial difference of position between men and women is always an issue in her
Hmm.
plays. It's
And
always an issue in her
hmm.
works. It's never an issue, or hardly ever an issue, in the plays by men of the period, because it doesn't occur to them that uh, that it's not the sex, that deciding to have sex if you're a woman and deciding to have sex if you're a man in the 1670s and in the 1680s is a
Very,
completely different
yeah.
thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that we have this character of Blunt in the Rover, who's the butt of all of the jokes, and the sort of main joke against him is
Mm,
that he believes that there is some sort of non-financially transactional
mm,
sort of amour going on, when
mm,
obviously the woman is a prostitute and is sort of conning him.
mm,
Which, yeah, it's an interesting extra layer on there. I was first introduced to the Rover sort of subconsciously through the musical On the Town, the Leonard
yeah.
Bernstein musical and the Stanley Donen film, where where one of the main differences from the source material is we're only with the men on who've got 24 hours. Gene Kelly, Frank Sinatra, the other guy, they've got 24 hours to have sex in New York and then get back
Mhm,
on their boat. That's sort of the drive in the
mhm,
entire film. And one of the
mhm,
interesting things going back to read the Rover, with the film sort of more firmly and the songs and this version of the story more firmly in the head, is how yeah, how what a difference it makes that we do start the play with Florinda and Helena, that we spend so much time with them, and that we are learning what they're thinking about things as well. And also Angelica, who could be quite a contemptible, like throwaway character in another telling of it. It
mhm,
does have a sort of a pathos. I
mhm.
feel there's some yeah, and I I wonder if like it's sort of hard to extract from the general question of um, is Ben unique because she is a woman, or is she unique because of something she's doing in her writing? Those two obviously interact with each other in all sorts of ways. But are there any precedents for these kinds of female characters in theatre before Ben? Helena, Florinda, are they? Is there something unique about them?
If one looks across, and of course I do this a lot because when I'm trying to work with these plays, I read across everything else that is on the stage in that season. And of course, everything else is by men. Um, and one of the things that really stands out to me as a difference between how Ben's plays work and how those of her contemporaries work is that I think Ben is deeply interested in psychology. She's interested in developing these figures, her characters, as people who reflect, who think. You've just been saying how Angelica Bianca in the Rover uh, has a kind of dignity, and the dignity comes in part from the fact that when she's at her most reflective, she speaks in verse. And this is something that Ben does a lot, which again is not common with her contemporaries, is that characters go into verse out of prose at the point that emotion gets going. And the play I'm currently most engaged with, because it's the one I'm working on, is The Feigned Courtesans. And The Feigned Courtesans is 2 years later than The Rover, so 1679. The play is full of women who are pretending to be prostitutes. That's what the play is all about. These women are pretending to be prostitutes, and notionally it gives them freedom, but in various ways they get caught or trapped or interfered with. And those women also will sometimes use verse. Um, but in terms of psychology, and if you've not read the play yet, I would recommend it to you, it is that the play is fascinated by um, two of its male figures. The one is the rakish young man, of course, who thinks he can have sex and move on. And the other is the young man who believes in love. And before the play started, he has, of course, fallen in love with a woman, promised to marry her, and the father has intervened. Um, this young man, whose name is Phillimore, um, is horrified in the first scene because he knows he's in love with Marcella, whom he's promised himself to. And he looks over there, and damn me, surely that must be Marcella because it looks right just like her, and I'm really strongly attracted to her. And he's assured that no, this young woman is a prostitute. And Phillimore spends the play torn between who he wants to be and thinks he should be, which is the constant lover who is faithful to the woman he's given his word to, and the fact that he is overwhelmingly drawn to this other woman who's a prostitute and he wants her. And he, throughout the play, is torn between staying in Rome, where he's met the prostitute, and going back to Viterbo, which is where he left the young woman he's in love with. Now, of course, one could stand back from that play and say, oh, but this is actually the same woman. Because it is, because the woman, the prostitute he's fallen in love with is his beloved dressed up. And you could say, oh no, the play is all about how deeply he recognizes her and that she's the same, however she's dressed, however she's behaved. But that is not what the play does with that dilemma. What it does is it gives Phillimore lines like, it cannot, must not be Marcella. You know, he sees this woman and he is full of conflict about what does the situation mean to him, to his situation. And to me, the fact that she does that with her young men in the Vain Courtesans is perhaps to me currently the clearest example of how Ben takes those standard stage scenarios and changes them and is interested in what makes people work, what makes them tick in a way that I think isn't yet happening on the stage more generally. You were asking me to what extent are her women different from the women, not only of her contemporaries, but of those that come before. And I mean, as you know, one of the standard tropes of the Restoration stage is the woman who cross-dresses as a young man. And of course, you've got that in Shakespeare. You have it, for instance, in As You Like It, which, of course, in Shakespeare is a wonderful kind of different kind of joke.
Double
'Cause you've got a
irony,
young
yeah.
man pretending to be a woman who then in As You Like It, Orlando then pretends to be a man in order to be courted by the man that he loves. Yeah.
Well, I think while we're on the feigned courtesans, it brings me
Mm.
to this interesting kind of rhyme with the sorrow of Angelica, because we get this Lucia Lucrezia character
Yeah.
who the whole time is playing an ingenious game, as it were, similar to Helena in the Rover,
Yeah.
in order to
Yeah.
get her man. And at least while reading it, I was very much on her side. She's going to pull it off. This is the
Yeah.
great scheme. And her sort of rival, one of the feigning courtesans, is somewhat less impressive, I think, in
Yeah.
her sort of wit and aptitude. Um, but then we have this disappointment of the ending where she ends up with her promised Giulio in kind of the good, everyone's back together, that's how it should be. And I wonder if the intention was to feel so disappointed, almost the perverse disappointment in Beauty and the Beast, when the beast becomes a man and you think, oh, well, that's not quite the same, is it? And so you have the ingenious Lucia who is unable to seduce her charge despite all of her great play and is thrown off with the quite underwhelming Giulio. In a
Yeah.
sense, now the moral status is equal, the promised lovers are together. Okay,
Mm.
that's fine. But do you suspect with Angelica, with
Mm.
Lucia, that there is meant to be this subtly disappointing or almost subversive charge that feeling of dissonance at the end, that, oh, that isn't quite how I wanted this one to end, might have been intentional, or am I sort of
Yeah,
overthinking
yeah. No,
the?
I don't necessarily agree with your reading of the Laura Lucretia character in Plain Courtesans and the ending of her plot. But you might be right. I haven't got far enough with the play yet to decide whether that is what I think. I certainly think with the Rover that was going on. You know, that people writing about the Rover in recent years have talked about you know, how Helena gets the man. She's chosen him and she gets him, and isn't that great? If you look at the scene at the end of the play where Wilmore, the rake, is talking about this marriage that he's going to have with Helena, all the metaphors are of hunting and hawking and, you know, control, if you like. And you think, get out of there, girl. Just run away, please. You know, go back to where you were when you were with your sister in the opening scene. And I think that what you're saying about the possibility that the plays are written in a way that gets the audience to refuse the ending is exactly one of the things that Ben will do. I don't know whether you know The Lucky Chance. It's one of the last plays. So in 1686 or 1687, 1686 it's first performed. In that play, there's a young woman who's, for financial reasons, married the older man, and but she's in love with another man. And there's an absolutely extraordinary scene where the young woman is sitting at her mirror, which is, you know, that's your stage picture. Here's your example. Here is woman's vanity. Woman sits at mirror. She's sitting looking at the mirror. In comes her elderly husband. And what becomes clear immediately to the audience is that he's decided he's going to have sex. He's telling his wife he's going to have sex with her tonight. And she's saying, has it got to be tonight? And he's saying, oh, yeah, it's got to be tonight. And he then says to her, look, I know that you were in love with another man. How would it be if I said, okay, you can have a night with him? And she, you know, the woman at the mirror, turns to her husband and says, no, it's absolutely true that I don't love you. I don't want you, but you're my husband. I've made my vow. I'm not going to have sex with another man. And he says, well, what if I tell you you can? And she still says, no, I've made my vows. No. Now, what the audience knows at this moment is that the husband is actually trying to talk his wife into having sex with this other man because he's lost a lot of money to this other man. And what he bet all that money he'd lost against, instead, you can have a night with my wife. And that's the bet that's taken place, and the last bet that the man has lost. So he's promised that he will give the lover a night with his wife, and he's trying to talk his wife into saying, "Oh yeah, you know, you'd be such a great husband if you let me have a night with this man." And she won't say that because that isn't what she feels, because she has psychology, because she has depth and complexity and so on. And so, of course, there's the bed trick where the husband gets the would-be lover carried into the room, and the wife thinks that it's her husband who's here in bed with her. And then when she realizes that it isn't her husband, according to the stage directions that Ben writes, Julia, the wife, erupts and you know, refuses to let this go on whilst the husband is outside the door listening and wondering what's going on. And she turns to the lover and he says, well, it was all your husband's fault. You know, he said that this could happen. And she says to him, well, yes, but could you who love me do this? And at the end of the play, the husband then gives his wife to the young lover and says, okay, you can have her. Now, I think that, you know, for me, that is the absolute epitome of the play, where the the audience is being asked not to accept the end of the play because Ben has given Julia the speech in which she says, "But if you love me, you wouldn't be doing this," you know.
Yeah, and the I don't really know how to read the tone of it, but the end of another one of her late plays, The Widow Ranter, which is
Mm,
about a sort of a rebellion in a Virginia plantation led
mm.
by it's a loosely based on real events. A man
Yeah,
named Nathaniel Bacon with a
Bacon.
sort of a militia force of the Indian, like the local population. They overthrow the government of William Berkeley, and at the end of that play, Bacon and the sort of Indian princess protagonist Semarina and the Indian king, whose name I can't remember. It sounds kind of Italian.
Cavania.
Cavani,
Cavania.
yes.
Yeah.
They all are excluded from the otherwise unanimous happy end,
Mm,
which has again, I it's hard to say how this plays to the contemporary audience, but
mm,
to me reading it, there's a deep melancholy in that, especially because
mm.
it's the only plot line of the four or five plot lines in that play that comes to like a really tragic ending. It really
Mm.
earns the appellation tragicomedy, and maybe
Yeah.
more tragic because it's in the minority. It's the only one.
Mm.
Everyone
Yeah.
else gets exactly what they want and have their happiness, and then we just like have to sort of and this main character, this Bacon, portrayed as I think quite positively, at least like it seems motivated by honor and um by by love for this princess.
Yeah.
Um,
I think, and again, we were talking earlier about how Ben uses verse in her plays
yes, yes.
to produce a sense of intensity, of emotional intensity. And although the first edition, the 1689 edition, um, lays out what the Indian king and queen say in prose and some of Bacon's speeches in prose, actually, if you look at them, this is iambic pentameter. And these characters are exactly going into this higher register of emotion, of intensity, of sincerity. And the speeches have the weight that you're talking about, I think, in part because they're verse. And when you're reading it, if you're reading an edition where it's not set as verse, you're hearing the verse, even though it's not set as that. So absolutely, written within the play are uh, pressures to pull you to not assent to the end as being merely happy, if you like.
And this
Yeah,
is always the difficulty in reading play scripts is you are,
yeah,
in a sense, losing a dimension. And especially
mm,
older play scripts, you have to second guess. I remember
mm,
my horror reading the scene with Blunt and Frederick, who up till now fairly kind of buffoonish characters who you're sort of endeared to by their buffoonery, and then they're
mm,
sort of crowding round to rape Florinda, who at this time
mm,
they assume to be a kind of low-class girl and it wouldn't be a problem.
yeah.
Later they discover, oh, she is of higher birth.
Or
We
she
shouldn't
might
do this.
be.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
We ought to back off. And
yeah,
reading it, I wondered, I suppose this could be played in a sort of grotesque, dark comedy. And
mm,
perhaps if it's very high energy, the crowd could really be finding it funny if their
mm,
particular moral compass is such that
mm,
you can joke about these people in the way that in the ancient Latin poetry,
mm,
slave girls, slave boys, that's game for comedy, even though we might find it horrific. And so I
mm,
was sort of playing a game with myself, like, is this horrible because I am reading this hundreds of years later with certain presumptions? On the stage, would this just be raucous? Is it a riot the whole way through? The responses to the Rover that I came across seemed like very funny play, and a lot of it is very funny. Or is it this more complex thing where you are suddenly thrown into these characters aren't what they seem to be? And then that whole sequence, especially, when they all say, oh, we'll all take a turn through the door, is
yeah,
this a point? Does this silence the audience? Is it subversive in that for the reading audience, they know what Aphra Behn is saying, but for the popular audience, it can still be a laugh? how do we know where to draw the line? I understand this
Mm,
verse thing is quite useful
yeah,
because it does
yeah,
give us an indication with Angelica. This is a
mm,
song, this is a lyrical lament. It's not just
mm,
complaining, it's not moaning,
mm,
and you probably
mm,
wouldn't play it like a joke. But yeah,
mm,
I wonder, do you find ever there are points where you're not too sure how it would be played? You know how you prefer to read it, but
mm.
how it would have been taken
Yeah,
contemporaneously.
yeah, absolutely. I think if a playwright is going to be successful, commercially successful, if you like, they have to write in a way where the audience can take it the way they want to take it, because people won't want to go to the play to the theatre and keep going if they feel they're being lectured. That's not what
Hmm.
you go to the theatre for. You would read a political pamphlet if that's what you wanted. So it has to work in a way where it works on stage. And I think that is one of the things that's really fundamental. And, Milo was asking, sorry, Jack was asking earlier, to what extent is Behn like or not like other women writers before her or of her time? And I would say that the fundamental thing is that she is writing for a living. And this is one of the things she says in her defense of her play, The Lucky Chance, that I was talking about just now, the husband who sells a night with his wife or tries to. She says that the author is forced to write for bread and not ashamed to own it. So she's very conscious of the fact that she has to engage an audience, keep them coming to the theatre, keep them wanting the next play, and so on. But at the same time, yeah, I believe, at least if you go back to the early plays, or as you say, you look at the extraordinary mix of stuff that's going on in the Rover, she has something to say which isn't just about audience pleasing, which is why we can continue to find the plays so interesting. And you were saying, Milo, that we come to learn in that last scene of the Rover um, that what's going to happen, who's going to have Florinda first, and so on and so forth. And of course, we don't just come. It isn't something that just happens. Ben invents a whole character, Valeria, Helena, and Florinda's cousin, who isn't there in the source at all. And Valeria is there in order to get Florinda out of the rape, to send her brother out quick looking. I think she's escaped, dressed like a boy, and off goes the brother who was about to go in and rape her, go first in the rape because he got the longest sword, so he could go first. And I mean that visual joke in the Rover, which is so appalling, where with the gang rape that's about to happen, the men decide who will go first by drawing lots, and it's who's got the longest sword. The man with the longest sword gets to go first, and it's the young woman's own brother who's got the longest sword. It's an appalling joke, and it's also funny, and that's clever. That's
Have you
really, really
seen
clever.
it live, like in with a
Yeah, yeah,
contemporary audience? Like, I'm
yeah.
curious, like, is it a riot? Are people laughing through the Rover when it's played now, or is it sort of weird, polite Shakespeare comedy laughter where people are not
Um,
quite sure?
one of the things that is typical of Ben, and the Rover would be a good example, is that it's full of sword fighting and it's full of dance and song. And so the last professional production I saw of The Rover, which was at the RSC back in 2016-17, I went 3 times. The theatre was full every night and the audience absolutely loved it. And they loved it because of the cleverness. I mean, you know what it's like when you watch stage fighting or stage sword fighting. It's extraordinary that the characters can move. The people can move like that. They don't end up dead or hurt. So it is completely absorbing, and all of the song and dance is like that as well. And I think at the time of the RSC Rover, the most recent one, we just had the Olympics down in South America. I can't remember, was it Brazil, whatever it was, where there'd
Yeah.
been all this kind of publicity about the seaminess of that underlaid the kind of golden land, if you like. And that really is what Naples is in the Rover. It's this place that's apparently wealthy, but underneath it there is this violent seaminess. And the 2016 production of the Rover very much drew on that, and that was that sense that we're in this dangerous place that is apparently attractive. Yeah.
Her final play, Emperor of the Moon, is quite surreal to read at times because of just how much
Wonderful.
music is in it.
Yeah.
It's like then they dance for 35 minutes and they like a stage direction, and you just have to sort of imagine this in your head. And I gather this is because it was largely based on the sort of Italian genre of like the commedia dell'arte, or it
Well,
takes a few tropes from it at any rate.
yeah, kind of. Yeah, I mean, there's a very successful French play called The Emperor of the Moon,
Yes.
L'Opéra de la Lune, in 1684, and 1687 is Behn's Emperor of the Moon. And there are some scenes from that play published, and my guess is that she'd read the published scenes, out of which she then invents the Emperor of the Moon. And she invents the whole kind of one of the things that happens in the Emperor Moon that's so engaging is that these two commedia figures, Harlequin and Scaramouche, are competing for the love of a woman called Mopseville. None of that is in the French original. And they have all these ridiculous battles to try and get her. There's one battle in which the one of them is with her in her bedroom, and the other one comes down into the garden below, dressed as a woman and claiming to be wanting to claim her lover, that she's pregnant with his baby. And of course, this is, really, she is a he, and so on and so forth. And Mopseville is wonderful because, as she informs us with great seriousness, the best thing about a man is his coach. So it's sort of liking a man for his car and the size of his car and the power of his car and so on. And there she is in 1687 making this joke. And of course, this is nothing to do with anything that's in the original. And what Behn does is she uses all of the extraordinary special effects of the Duke's theatre, of flying machines and changing locations and so on. So, there's a point in which a chariot flies in, and we need to remember this is before electricity. This is before modern, and in comes a chariot with 12 characters of the zodiac.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And just as, it probably doesn't happen as much today, but certainly when I was young, one of the things that was like a really big deal with the cinema was how on earth did they do that special effect in the film? And you might go and see the film repeatedly to try and work out how the special effect is done. So similarly, in Behn's plays, using all of these special effects, they're going to bring the audience along with, as you say, the song and dance and all of that extraordinary stuff. And the play was so successful that it stayed on stage until the 1740s, every season. And this is at a time when the theatre as an institution in England is failing. The one of the theatre companies has collapsed. The two theatre companies have merged into the United Company. Most of Behn's male contemporaries, who are writing plays, give up. Join the army, go to the madhouse, go and live their patrons, whatever. You can't make a living as a playwright anymore. Because the United Company has got so many plays now, because it's got all the plays being written for both companies. Aphra Behn writes The Emperor of the Moon, and it's a massive success. And the play I was just talking about earlier, The Lucky Chance, she writes that play, which is just absolutely extraordinary at this time that the plays, the theatres are closing. And then, of course, she dies, and The Widow Ranter, set in Virginia, that you were talking about earlier, and one we've not mentioned at all, The Younger Brother. Those two plays, The Younger Brother and The Widow Ranter, are performed first posthumously. But, she continues to be successful as a playwright, whilst almost everybody else
While the
has given up.
medium is crumbling, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, why do you think that one of the reasons that might be just the quality of the plays, or
Yeah.
yeah,
I think she was damn good.
mm,
And as you know, the personnel, the actors of the acting of the companies were well known. Again, a bit like modern actors in film, that people might go to this film because it's got so and so in it. And you look at The Emperor of the Moon, all but one of the players in The Emperor of the Moon is one of the famous actors of the day. And the only one who isn't becomes famous in the course of the next decade. So, she writes for and she casts the actors that people are going to want to go and see.
mm,
With The Emperor of the Moon, she shows off what the theatre space can do. And people will come again and again to see it done. So I think it is, yeah, because she was so good. Because also, meanwhile, of course, she started writing novels and poetry and translating from French, and she's successful in on all of those fronts as well. And then she dies. So,
yeah. As well as like you've mentioned psychology, that how good the psychology of her characters is, the spectacle, the opportunity she gives for actors to really get into their roles. What are some of the other things just that really that make her unique, that make her really great?
there's what now is quite an old book, uh, Robert D. Hume's Development of the English Stage, which is back from the 1970s. And I remember the first time I read that book, uh, Rob Hume only has a couple of pages on Behn, in which he says effectively that if you look at her plays in sequence and think across to what's going on stage, in the theatre at the time, you can see she absolutely has her finger on the pulse. She knows how the fashions are changing, what's becoming popular, what's going to work. So she changes and changes and changes. Her plays are extraordinarily different from one another. And then, as I say, she is also a poet and a translator and a
Hmm.
novelist, and she's successful in on all of these fronts. Um, and so partly she's so talented, and partly I think almost in a way, she couldn't help herself. She had to do this. She had to write. The volume that she produces, and we know that in the years between 1670 when her first play is staged and 89 when she dies. So in that 19 years, she has performed 18 plays and two others that she probably part wrote. And there's all that fiction, there's all that poetry,
Yeah,
and
which we've
gosh,
not touched on at all, but
Mm.
no.
yeah, yeah.
So she was absolutely prolific.
Mm,
Um, so she must have loved it, you know.
mm,
And I think through her theatre, we got to Emperor at the Moon, which in a way is one of the
Mm.
most remarkably strange plays
Yeah,
she produced. And it's this kind of
yeah,
pseudo sci-fi grand mask of the sky and stars.
yeah,
However, one
yeah.
of those consistent themes throughout all the plays of hers that I've read is that they all revolve somewhat about marriage as an institution or as a kind of representation of love, something
Mm.
approaching these lines. But do we know or can we guess what Aphra Behn actually thought about marriage? Because we have this rakish character type, maybe epitomized by Wilmore, who really reminds me quite a lot of the Earl of Rochester, who was very much
Mm.
knocking around in this period, and a lot of what
Mm.
he had to say about love and romance and its ephemerality and these things come and go. And a lot of the plots of her plays, especially The Lucky Chance, which we've been talking about, sort of undermine certain versions of marriage or consider them to be done for reasons that are not honorable or for economic sort of motivations. And then we have, I think it's Sir Feeble, and then the romantic hero of The Lucky Chance. And Sir Feeble has faked the death of the hero in order, and the heroine and the hero have this contract, this unofficial marriage contract, which is being overruled by the official kind of under the church marriage contract between Sir Feeble and herself. And I wonder if we do get a cynical, even anti view of marriage or its sanctity, this notion that it is a useful thing to exploit as a woman and that one must be careful about it. but that true love does not really course through its veins, and that the real life doesn't happen in marriage, but kind of below and around marriage? Or is that just the romantic principle of the dramas? Are we getting something radical said about marriage through Behn?
I think there's truth in what you're saying, but I probably wouldn't go from there. I would want to think about, okay, so what else is she up to? So, for instance, one of the last poems is written in the voice of a woman, and it's to the fair Clorinda, imagined more than woman. And it's about how extraordinary it is that these two women are clearly sexually involved with each other and sexually attracted to each other, but nobody would imagine that anything is going on here because they're only women and they're only holding hands. So what I'm saying is and this is not the only example. There are other examples in Behn where you can think about homosexual desire and connection between women going on. There's also, as I mentioned with the Rover, this strong sense of women looking after each other, being interested in each other, having relations with each other. In A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf talks about how works by men are all about how women feel about men, basically. Or, when women appear, the only thing they're concerned about is men. And Virginia Woolf says, and how small a part of a woman's life is that? And that there's a sense in which I think Behn also gives that sense that there is more to a woman's life than the relationship with an individual man whom she might marry. Just as there is also more to her men and to a man's life than marriage. So I think you're right that the plays in various ways are questioning marriage, but I think they question it in ways that suggest that there are other things go on in life. And if you're Mopsophil, the most important thing is the man's carriage. After all, is his Jaguar. It's not.
Yeah. Or I love the part of the conceit of the Emperor of the Moon is that we have this, this, is he a duke, some sort of title, and he's impossible to fool until you mention the moon, and then anything you say he will immediately believe. Just
Yes. Yeah.
almost like I don't know, I picture him as sort of the modern conspiracy theory person, where certain ideas, they're just not going through, but as soon as you put it into this sort of grand design, if you put it in the context of his general theory of the universe, then everything slots in beautifully. We've not talked about just the sort of comic setup of the Emperor of the Moon. I just think it's a really interesting plot that we have, and sort of I can't quite tell what it's parodying because we're so remote from the time, but we have this this duke who is sort of involved in natural philosophy in some extent. It's like alchemy. A doctor, sorry,
Dr.
an oddity.
Baliardo.
Yes.
Dr. Baliardo, which means Dr. Numbskull, Dr. Idiot.
Yes.
He's a commedia character. And I think part of the play's enduring fascination is that we all know a man who is so obsessed with something that he's an idiot, basically, because he's only obsessed with so-and-so. And that's what Behn turns him into, is this figure who is so completely obsessed that he's easy to fool.
Yeah. I'm reminded of like the Blake illustration of Isaac Newton crouched over the paper and completely immune to the obvious reality of what's happening around him. And it gets to the point.
But people have sometimes wanted to read the play because people tend to know a little bit about the period, and they think, okay, this will slot in there. So people tend to people might know, for instance, that the Royal Society, with its interest in science, is formed in the 1660s. All the posh men belonged to the Royal Society in the 1680s, which is when The Emperor of the Moon is written. But with The Emperor of the Moon, they tend not to notice that it's dedicated to Charles Somerset, who was the youngest man ever to join the Royal Society. He was 13 when he joined it. I mean, not when she dedicated the play to him. So I do not believe that the play is sending up the Royal Society. You can read it that way if you want, or you could read it as I say, sending up any person you can think of who's obsessed and
With anything, yeah.
with anything if you like. And that's why the play stays successful. So when Ben writes it, when it's first performed, there is this stage direction where Dr. Baliardo gets to see the moon, or he thinks he's seeing the moon. And the stage direction says that Scaramouche, his servant, is made to carry onto stage a telescope that is 22 feet long more. And can you imagine walking onto the stage carrying something that is 22 feet long or more?
Yeah.
And then Dr. Baliardo believes he's looking through the telescope, but of course, one of the other Commedia characters is at the end of the telescope holding up pictures of things that Dr. Baliardo now imagines he's seeing on the moon. And this is how he begins to be tricked. And the stage direction is explicit that as these things are held up for Dr. Baliardo to see and be astonished by, they're held up first to the audience, so the audience knows how he's being fooled. So the audience is being invited to enjoy being cleverer than Dr. Blockhead. Yes.
Yeah. Kind of like we were talking to Emma Smith about Iago in Othello. There's some of that going on as well. That watch me do this. Yes. Yeah, I like how that it gets to the point where the Doctor he starts to not even believe his own eyes when they're contradicting the moon story. So people can just suddenly get into a statue position, or they become a tapestry, and they say we're
become a tapestry. Yes,
and it's immediately believable when it's put into the moon world context.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, great stage directions in general. I like there's I don't know, just again giving the actor loads of free rein. It's like Dr. Baliardo bursts with joy and weeps most humorously. Things like that are constantly in there.
Yeah, exactly. And just at the end of the play, when Dr. Baliardo learns that he's been tricked, and the stage direction that says that he leaps up and he then goes off into this speech, which is clearly taken from, well, not exactly taken from, but based on, Christopher Marlowe's idea of burn my books. It's Dr. Faustus. But he leaps up, we're told. And the actor who plays Dr. Baliardo is famous in the day for having this comic leap, if you like. And so Ben is obviously wants to use this actor at this moment. It's a bit like a Monty Python funny walk that has to come out at this moment, if you like, to engage.
And that's funny. And keeping it hidden. The audience are watching the whole time. When is he going to do his leap?
Yes, that's right. We've been waiting now for 2 hours. Yes.
Yeah.
Do they ever put it on these days? So when was the last production of Emperor of the Moon?
There have been a couple of amateur productions down in Canterbury, because of course Canterbury is now starting to embrace Aphra Behn as being, she's their daughter. But there hasn't been a proper modern production, and I would love to see it done.
Big opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna come to an end now. It's been an absolute joy to have you on, Elaine. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I hope you find something useful amongst all of this anyway. Let's hope it brings more enthusiastic audiences and readers to Ben.
Yeah, and I'd love people, just to read this outside of academia as well. I mean, it's just they're so fun. They're such sort of fun plays to read. I really enjoyed just sort of doing the reading for this episode again.
I tell you a play that if you haven't read, you need to read. is the false count. And in the
Okay.
false count, you've got this kind of standard scenario of older man married to younger woman who's really in love with somebody else. And but also within it is the character called Gwilliam. And Gwilliam is a chimney sweeper. And the posh men think they're going to use the chimney sweeper to do what they want to achieve. And Ben gives the chimney sweeper, William, all his own plot, and he gets everything his own way. And there are a couple of very, very funny scenes where William, pretending not to be a chimney sweeper, but pretending to be the false count, marches up and down the stage, talking about his rustling pole and what he's going to do with it, and how pleased he is. So The False Count is a very funny play and should be staged. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk about Aphra Behn anyway.
Now, all the
Thank you.
best, Elaine.
Thank
Ciao.
you. Okay, bye.
Bye.